"Lift them up, boys. It'll be the last of them." The supervisor shouted at the top of his lungs as the guys lifted the last of the containers to put on the cargo. We just finished some delivery on the East Coast a few days ago, and we were about to take a week or two off before scheduling another trip when we received an offer I couldn't deny. Some people say we aren't giving our wives a good life, but that simply wasn't true. Sure, my wife missed me whenever I was gone for 3 weeks at a time, but whenever I'd come back, she was always there to welcome me. Very few couples can say they've seen the face of a loved one when they've missed them very much, and I get to see it several times a year when I do big travels. I'm not talking about that sweet cavity-inducing, "Oh, I miss you, baby," bullshit that you see on TV shows when a couple have been separated for a whole fucking 3 hours. No. I mean the wholesome look a wife gives her husband when she's craved his presence and counted the days until his return. That cannot be possibly replicated. And the way my wife looks at me when I return from long trips, I don't think love has a purer form than that. Now usually, I would keep to shorter distances. For example, between Vancouver and Alaska, or Vancouver and some places close on the West Coast. Travels that would last anywhere between, 3 to 10 days, Because like any man who loves his wife, I don't like being away from her for far too long. And I don't like knowing that she might have tortured herself worrying over how the trip was going for me, or if I was fine. You see, the life of a sailor wasn't exactly the most dangerous, but when the seas get rough, even the cargo captain like me had to hold tight. You know what I mean? Well, I don't know, probably not if you've never been on the open water. When the waves get rough in the middle of the ocean, you never know if one's going to be enough to cause problems. In my 25 years as a captain, I've never had much of a problem. I mean, call me lucky if you want, but I don't have many sailor stories that are worth mentioning. I'm sure I got stuck in a shitty tempest once and we all got deviated from our course. It made a regular week's worth of travel a few days longer. Well, that was about it. Cargoes are usually resilient ships, so you don't get to be rocked too much with them. Especially a container ship like the ones I'm used to dealing with. So anyway, I got offered this job from my boss, but there were a few conditions with it. We're told the cargo is different. The words art and pricey are thrown around a few times to make me understand that this isn't the usual kind of shipping thing. Now I pay little attention because, as the captain of the ship, I'm not the one actually in charge of the cargo. I guess I am, but I'm not the one actually taking care of it. I just make sure we get from point A to point B without too many problems. Cargo and its safety? Well, that's the operations supervisor's job. Anyway, we're paid a solid amount, so about 47 days. Well, the traveling so long has some advantages. Now, it's not to boast or anything, but as an international ship captain with my cards and all, I get to choose my jobs, and I also have the experience to back it up. I remember when I first began, I used to only do an inland sailing and ended up with an average yearly salary about, $50,000 or so. Now, I've more than doubled that by making a few international trips a year. I'm a very well paid ship captain, that's for sure. But even I got tempted with the proposition I received. 2 months for $30,000 is a good offer as any. You feel me? Hell, I couldn't say no. I usually make about 10 grand a month, so hell, that was a halfway decent bonus. And plus, well, I didn't mention it before, well, the wife and I have a baby on the way. Whatever. I came home that night and told my 6 months pregnant wife that I would be gone for about 2 months this time. But I'd be back before she gave birth. Now, she didn't feel safe and comfortable about it, but she let me know. And I told her that with, well, 10K over, I could probably take a few weeks off of work and then keep inland for a few months after. I made her understand that it was a really good thing for us. And we talked about the possibility of her giving birth before the end of her term, but I reassured her. Told her that I would not miss it for all the money in the world. And it took her a few days to accept it, but I could see something was still bothering her. She kept asking questions about the cargo, and the closer to the departure date we got, the more anxious she got. She said she had nightmares, and she felt like I shouldn't get on the trip. And well, I blame the hormones. I blame the fact that she was pregnant with a child, but really, what was happening is now clear and simple to me. She felt it in her bones, in her flesh, in her blood, that something was wrong with the cargo. I didn't listen. That was my first mistake. Kissed her goodbye and got on the ship, and I did my job as the boys filled the deck with containers of various sizes and weights. Within half a day, the cargo was about 7 tons heavier, and I was done studying the route we were given. Pretty simple. 23 days and nights of sailing between Vancouver and Japan. Museum guy by the name of Yashiro Takawa was going to welcome us when we arrived, and I was instructed to have him sign papers after all the containers would have been secured and verified on location. It was about, 48 days of travel, with 24 hours break in Japan after the delivery to sleep, eat, shower, and prepare for the return trip while they checked the delivery. It seems simple enough, really. Plus, I've done that route before, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. And I remember the trip went like a breeze, nothing to worry about. Once the supervisor was done shouting, I signed some insurance thing in case something happened, and we finally set sail around 7 or 8 o'clock that night. I clocked out around midnight after setting the course and notifying my junior to keep an eye on the sea. The night was peaceful, but a bit humid. There will likely be fog in the morning, and I woke up about 6 in the morning to the noise of rowdy men shouting in the hallway. I thought maybe someone got in a disagreement with another crewmate, but as I dressed up, I heard one of them talk about voices coming from a container. Now, that was worrying, alright, because if I was transporting illegals to Japan, I could not only risk my career, but also a jail sentence. I took these accusations very seriously. I sped up my morning routine and got out to meet with the 3 or 4 guys talking in the hallway. So you said you heard voices coming from the containers? He corrected me and said it was only one voice, probably young and female. Did we get a rat? Now, sometimes we have a stowaway or two trying to get free travel to Japan, and I told him to show me where the voice came from, and he asked the cargo supervisor to come with us. We soon arrived at an isolated container. I tapped on the side, trying to surprise whoever would be inside. Then, stuck my ear against the metal. I couldn't hear shit, and it's not like I could just open the cargo. We were paid a good amount of money to bring those locked up containers back to Japan, and well, I didn't have the keys to that awfully big lock. After telling the deck supervisor to keep an eye and ear out on the one particular container, I went about my day as usual, and as I'd predicted, the morning was foggy. The fog was thick and white and cold as it brushed against our faces on the deck. Fortunately, I wasn't one of the poor saps who were deck-bound. I was pretty comfortable inside the captain's cabin, protected by a large bay window. We had to decrease our speed from 40 knots to about, 30 to 35 because of the fog, but once it cleared, we got back up to 40 so we wouldn't be late. A few hours could do, but a whole day would mean that we'd have to pack our return trip as soon as we got off of this one. Now, we don't hear a yap about the noise coming from the container for a few more days. And by then, we were about a week into the trip, when this one night, our 30-member crew got awoken by a loud noise, like an axe repeatedly hitting a metal bar. And that was exactly what was happening. We heard the snarl of a man, and a loud clinking noise of metal meeting metal, then an equally loud scream that turned my blood to ice. I barely had the time to put my pants on and make my way to the deck when I saw the man's body fall to the ground with a loud thud. From my point of view, I just saw him lose consciousness. I reached to him, and his body was covered in sweat. The fire axe still held tightly despite him losing consciousness. His knuckles were white, and the expression on his face, if not for his closed eyes, looked nothing like a man who just passed out. He looked like he'd seen something horrible. His lips were curled, his brows were arched, and his face was pale as a ghost. Now, it took him a few minutes to come to. Well, when he did, he woke up screaming and tried to swing his axe at me. I regretted in that instant not taking it away from his grasp first, but my reflexes weren't bad. I managed to capture his wrist, and another crewmate intervened, taking the axe out of his hand. And soon enough, there was a small group of us gathered around him. We all watched him as the confusion drained from his face. There was something strange in the way he looked at us. Just weird. He looked at the container and then back at us. I couldn't put my finger on it, but, well, it creeped me out like a hell of a lot. "You okay, son?" I asked him, finally releasing his wrists. Now, he didn't answer right away. He simply looked at all of us, his blood rushing back into his cheeks. And then he said he was fine and started to explain. It was the same guy who told us he heard a voice coming from the container at the beginning of the trip. Told us he wasn't sure he'd heard something weird again. Like a complaint or a girl moaning, but not in a sexy way. He said he thought someone was dying of dehydration in there. Now at that moment, oh hell, I remember it so clearly, we all looked to the container. It was empty. Now, mind you, empty containers or even two wasn't a big deal. And after all, we weren't supposedly carrying a big loot cargo with art pieces and stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if they put a few empty ones in case we tried opening them. We could easily explain one open container accidentally, but if we were to open more, that'd be less plausible as an accident. So all in all, opening that container was bad, but it wasn't too bad. We could still explain it with a whole stowaway thing and not have insurance on our ass for breaking a lock. I asked our medic trainee to take the guy away and give him a day off, as well as some medication to calm his nerves, even if he said he was okay. I wanted him ready to be back at work the next day, because we needed all our hands on deck for the next 14 to 15 days. We gave the guy meds he needed and dealt with our sailing and left it at that. Now, things got weird in the following days. At first, we thought people were playing hide and seek. We lost the man. I don't know, literally, we lost a man on board the ship. Hell, we couldn't find him at all. The officer in charge of the lower deck had just vanished into thin air. We looked everywhere for him, but we couldn't find him. We found his body 3 days later, stuck behind the boilers. Bottom half of his face was missing. When I say missing, it was completely gone. It was like someone stuck fingers in his mouth and pulled until the jaw broke, and then used, superhuman force to tear off the whole face. His tongue was lolling out of a gaping hole in his neck, and flies and rats had already started biting and nibbling on his flesh. It was a horrific vision, one that I hope I'd never see again. But, you see, what terrified me most was his eyes. The way his big ol' eyes were open and stuck in an expression of sheer terror. Even dead, his face remained full of emotion and expression. I'd never seen something so fucked up in my entire life. We called the Coast Guard, but we were only about halfway into our trip, and clearly this was not a natural death. We had to stick him in a freezer until we would land. Needless to say, we were all shaken. We advised all men not to wander alone at night until we figured out what had happened. But it was pretty clear what had happened. Someone went fucking nuts and tore this guy's face before stuffing his body behind a boiler. The heat of the boiler also made the poor lad's skin bubble up and burn. Hell, the stench was disgusting. If I had been faint of heart, I would probably have emptied my stomach at the sight. Still, can't say I slept well the following night, or many nights after. The crew was taken out one by one. A man disappeared and we found his legs, and only his legs next to the rail. They were cut cleanly, as if a laser saw had just cut him past the knees and pushed his upper body in the water. Weirdly enough, despite the wind, they were solidly rooted in the ground. We realized soon enough that whoever killed the man had stuck 4-inch nails into his feet to keep him stuck into the floor. How come we didn't hear him scream? I don't know. Hell, we didn't want to know. But after the second death on board, everyone was getting a little nervous. The guy's partner had also gone missing, and people instinctively assumed it was him. But my guts were telling me something was wrong with the cargo. When we found the third body, I remembered my wife's worry. I remember how she told me something was off with this trip and how I didn't listen to her. And I decided it was time to protect myself. I went back to the captain's table. I picked up my Glock and filled its chamber with bullets. I'd keep it with me at all time. After the third mangled body we found, I wasn't taking any chances. But the killing stopped for 3 days. There wasn't a single man disappearing. No one sick, no one injured. Everybody on board was on edge, but we knew we had little over 4 more days to go. On the third night, we heard a cry for help, and we all but rushed to the deck, but we were too late. By this time, we already lost 3 people, and our crew's morale was dwindling. And despite the fog that night, we could see him right where his body stood. The poor man had been skewered with a broken pipe, and his guts were spilling out, blood dripping out of the pipe like a fountain. The scent of his blood carried in the wind, and I could almost feel its warmth on my face. Seconds later, another scream pierced through the atmosphere, 2 decks lower. We found one of our youngest hung in the pipe room, but his eyes had been pulled out of their sockets and stuffed in his mouth. Now after that, I could have tried anything, but I would never have been able to stop the paranoia that ensued. We were 25 on board after those 5 deaths, and, well, the 25 of us were petrified. We locked ourselves in the cafeteria where there was food and there could be a surveillance system, but people distrusted each other. Everybody was ready to accuse everyone. Words that were sharp enough to cut like blades were thrown carelessly. Fights were started. I had to separate 2 guys from beating the shit out of each other, and then everything fell apart. People decided to leave and stay in their quarters until we would land. Stuffed food in their jacket for the last 3 days and said they would lock the door and shoot or stab anyone who dared to approach on sight. By the next night, we'd lost 6 more members. Tried to make a group call and, well, only about 14 people showed up on the 25 that was left. We went in groups to search for the others, but on the 11 missing, we only recovered 5. The 6 others had been destroyed in their rooms. Destroyed. I'm talking guts open, limbs missing, clawed at like a zoo lion decided they were their next stuffed toy victim, chewed the fuck out of their life. Christ, some of them were so brutalized, well, we couldn't even recognize their bodies. There was one in particular that had been gutted from the cock to chin and hooked up on the wall of his bedroom in a grotesque Jesus-like cross display. His arms were stretched and feet were stuck together, and he had been opened from wrist to shoulder and ankle to hips, revealing the bones, flesh, and, well, everything beneath. His bed was a pool of blood and guts. We didn't even bother unhooking him. We closed the door behind, and I heard one of my crew members vomit behind me. Only 2 days left and more than a third of the crew were gone. At this point, sailing the ship would prove difficult. We couldn't be in all the places at all the times, checking on this or that section. On the final day, well, it attacked in the day. Anyone who traveled alone ended up gutted, axed, or hung. And when we were about 7 left, we decided to stick together. We tried to call the Coast Guard, the Navy, or hell, anybody at that point, but the signal couldn't be received. And when we went up to check our radio antenna, there was a body wrapped around it, bones piercing out of its flesh. I didn't know who he was anymore, his face unrecognizable by this point. The skull was caved in, and he had been scalped and disfigured. Seagulls were biting at its flesh when we found him, which was both reassuring and not reassuring because nobody wants their corpse to be eaten by birds, and reassuring because birds, well, they meant that we were getting closer to land. We tried to stick together, but we were still taken out. On the last night, when there were only 4 of us left, and we were ready to believe anyone did it, we were only 4 left of a crew of 30 when we finally realized who it was. The man who'd first heard the voice and whose gaze had sent shivers down my spine. When we were locked in the cafeteria again, trying to figure out who was the culprit, I met his gaze, and despite the words of worry escaping his mouth, it was crystal clear to me. I could almost hear a little girl's giggle coming off of him. Or maybe it was in my head. After all, I was going crazy with all the deaths around here. But I wasn't going to let him take me out. I pointed my gun at his head and I hoped I would see fear, but the smile stretched eerily. And when he spoke, his voice sounded disembodied, his head tilted at a weird angle. And he said, "Boo." At that time, all the lights on the ship shut down in that instant, and I pulled the trigger. I pulled the goddamn trigger, and I heard the most vicious, girly laugh I'd ever hear in my entire life. The two other men left with me were screaming, and all I could do was stand up and run. And I ran towards the captain's cabin, knocked my knee pretty badly on the metal frame of the cafeteria door as I heard squelching noises behind me and the sound of one of the men's bones breaking. But there wasn't any screaming. I don't think I can ever forget that noise. When the cafeteria door opened, I dashed down the hallway with one of my hands following the wall. I've been on that cargo ship for the last 20 years. I knew it like my back pocket, which was my only advantage. I heard the other man ask me to help him, calling out for the captain to rescue him, but I couldn't see shit in the dark. I kept running toward the captain's cabin when I heard the loud thud of his body falling to the ground and the same disgusting squelching noise from before. And then, loud, running steps toward me. I barely had the time to make it to the captain's cabin, and I felt the murderer's hand on my shoulder. I turned around and shot 4 bullets in its chest, but its grip wouldn't relent on my shoulder, and I slammed my head against his, and I heard a deep ringing in my ears. He fell to the ground, and I straddled him and started punching him. I don't remember when I stopped, but I couldn't feel my hands anymore. And I locked myself in the cabin for the remaining hour until we landed. The Japanese officer looked at me like I was a madman, but he didn't say anything. In the background, police officers were pulling up the camera surveillance from the ship, radio, hell, anything that would prove or disprove what I said. They started pulling the corpses away too. And I felt terrible when a particular one passed me, like something evil was leering at me from over my shoulder. And I heard the whispers, feminine giggles and moans coming from what I assumed was the murderer's body bag.